I'd been driving for hours, winding my way along the remote stretches of Highway 68 in Tennessee, letting the dark mountains rise and fall around me. The divorce was still fresh, and the open road was the only thing that made sense. Out here, I didn't have to think about what went wrong or where I'd end up. I'd been drawn to this lonely highway by some instinct, hoping it might offer me something, some strange new experience that could shake me out of this haze. Then I saw the sign. Hand-painted in faded red letters on a crooked wooden board, it read, "The Dark Carnival, one night only. Turn right ahead." The letters were smeared, almost blurred, and the paint looked like it hadn't been fresh in years. But there it was, posted right off the shoulder of the highway, lit up by my headlights. A carnival out here? And why hadn't I seen it advertised before? Curiosity sparked inside me, stronger than it should have been. Maybe it was the promise of something strange. Something to pull me out of the depths of my own thoughts. Whatever the reason, I found myself slowing down, checking the narrow, winding road that branched off to the right. My headlights illuminated a long stretch of trees, shrouded in darkness. I knew better, but I turned anyway. The road was dark, nearly invisible as it wound through dense woods that pressed in from either side. I drove for a mile, then 2, my pulse quickening. And then, just when I was about to turn around, I saw the lights, flickering, pale, illuminating the clearing ahead. There it was. The carnival looked old, faded, like a relic that had somehow been preserved here in the forest. Tattered tents, half lit by strings of bulbs, stood in a rough circle. A rusty carousel sat off to one side, its horses frozen in eerie mid-leap, their faces contorted in strange expressions. The whole place had an unnatural stillness to it, a silence that felt wrong. I parked the RV, stepped outside, and shivered as the cold night air wrapped around me. Everything in me screamed to get back inside and drive away, but curiosity pulled me forward. "Welcome, Tom," a voice called from the darkness. I spun around and saw him, a carnival barker, tall and thin, dressed in a faded red coat, his face stretched into a too-wide smile. His eyes were dark and piercing, and somehow I couldn't shake the feeling he'd been waiting for me. "Who? How do you know my name?" I stammered, my voice weak in the stillness. The man chuckled, tapping his cane against the ground. "Names have a way of revealing themselves in places like this. You came all this way for a reason, didn't you?" He took a step closer, his smile stretching wider. "One game, Tom. Just one game, and maybe you'll find what you're looking for." My gut twisted. I wanted to leave, but his words held a strange power. It was like he could see right through me, straight into the aimlessness that had taken over my life. "What kind of game?" I asked, swallowing hard. The barker gestured with his cane toward a booth with a weathered shooting gallery, and I followed him, the sounds of my own footsteps seeming too loud in the quiet. The booth was filled with old, chipped bottles and rusted targets, each painted with the vague outline of a face, though they were warped and distorted, like memories faded with time. "Just knock down the targets," the barker said, handing me an old-fashioned rifle with a wink. "Every shot is a chance to reclaim what you lost." A thrill of excitement mixed with unease settled over me as I raised the rifle and aimed. I squeezed the trigger, and the first target shattered, the sound echoing through the empty carnival grounds. For a moment, I thought I heard a whisper, a soft, familiar voice. I shook it off, thinking it was just my imagination, and aimed at the next target. Another shot, another shattered target. But this time, I felt something strange, a twinge in my chest like something had been taken from me. The whispers grew louder, voices I hadn't heard in years. "Tom." I froze. The voices were distorted but familiar. My ex-wife, old friends, people I hadn't thought about in years. Each voice came with a face that flickered through my mind. Faces of people I'd left behind. "What? What is this?" I asked, turning to the barker, but he only smiled, his expression unreadable. "Keep going, Tom. You're getting closer." I didn't know what that meant, but I couldn't stop. I aimed and fired again and again, each shot filling the silence with echoes that twisted through my mind. With every hit, the memories grew sharper, more vivid, until they were almost real. Then I saw her. In the center of the gallery, the last target had changed. The face on it wasn't just a vague outline anymore. It was my ex-wife, her eyes filled with the same hurt she'd had when I left her. I felt my hand shake as I raised the rifle, my vision blurring. "You want to be free, don't you, Tom?" The barker's voice whispered from beside me. "Finish the game, and you'll have the life you've always wanted." I hesitated, my heart pounding. I looked away, hoping the image would disappear, but when I turned back, her face was still there, staring at me, waiting. In a moment of desperation, I pulled the trigger. The target shattered, the pieces scattering into the darkness, and in that instant, I felt a sharp pain, like something vital had been ripped out of me. "Congratulations," the barker said softly, his smile widening. "You've won." But as I turned to leave, I noticed the carnival had changed. The lights were dimmer, the tents leaning and torn, as though they'd aged decades in a matter of seconds. The path back to my RV was gone, replaced by a twisting maze of tents and empty stalls. I ran, the barker's laughter echoing through the carnival, growing louder, blending with the whispers in my mind. Every turn brought me back to the shooting gallery, to the spot where I'd seen her face, frozen in that moment of pain. "Let me out!" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the oppressive darkness. "I'm done with your games." The barker appeared from the shadows, his face twisted with amusement. "There's always a price, Tom. You can't escape until you've paid it." Desperate, I stumbled into a nearby tent. Inside was an old woman draped in tattered scarves, her eyes dark and empty. She looked at me with pity, like she'd seen this before. "You can only leave by giving up what holds you here," she said, her voice a faint whisper. "You know what it is." In a moment of realization, I reached into my pocket and felt the weight of my wedding ring. I'd kept it with me all these years, a reminder of what I'd lost, of the life I couldn't let go of. I held it out to her, my hands trembling. She nodded, taking the ring, her fingers cold and withered. "Walk to the edge of the carnival and don't look back," she said, "and whatever you do, don't listen to the voices." I ran, my heart pounding, my breath ragged. The barker's voice followed me, taunting, calling me back with whispers of promises he knew I couldn't keep. Shadows flickered at the corners of my vision, distorted faces reaching for me, pleading, accusing. As I neared the exit, I felt the pull grow stronger, a temptation to turn around, to see if maybe, just maybe, there was a way to take back the life I'd given up. The barker's voice filled my mind, smooth and persuasive, offering me the happiness I'd lost, the peace I'd been running from. But I forced myself forward, refusing to look back, refusing to listen. At last, I stumbled out into the dark clearing where my RV waited, cold and silent beneath the night sky. I threw open the door, climbed inside, and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I drove back to the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the carnival fading into the trees behind me. But there was nothing there, just empty road stretching into darkness. Relieved, I took a breath, my grip loosening on the steering wheel. But when I looked in the mirror again, I froze. The barker's face was there, grinning back at me from the shadows, his eyes dark and unblinking. I turned back, and of course, there was nothing behind me. But even now, as I drive down the empty highway, I can still feel his eyes, watching, waiting. And somewhere, deep in the night, the carnival is still calling my name. The forest around Silent Pines was still and heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I parked my RV in the lonely gravel lot, stepping out into the silence that settled over the dense pines towering above me. A perfect, untouched scene. The old trails and endless greenery were what I needed, I'd convinced myself, an escape from my life as a marine biologist, the career that had burned me out completely. It felt strange to be here, alone and free, with no one to report to but myself. I was ready to lose myself in the natural world, to study it on my own terms. Silent Pines was said to be one of the purest and most untouched sections of forest in the Northwest, and though it was rumored to be haunted, I'd shrugged off the warnings as nothing more than local folklore. The song, they called it, a strange melodic hum that drifted through the trees, luring anyone who heard it deeper and deeper into the forest. They said that people who wandered too far after dark, drawn by the song, sometimes vanished entirely, never to be seen again. To me, it was all part of the appeal, a strange and beautiful mystery. I was here to document whatever flora or fauna I could find and perhaps to write about the lore itself. If I happened to hear this fabled song, I'd count it as a bonus. The day passed in peaceful solitude as I explored the trails, taking notes and photos of the flora, relishing the stillness that wrapped around me like a warm blanket. But as dusk fell, I found myself feeling strangely unsettled. The quiet had deepened, a thick silence so complete it felt unnatural, as if the trees themselves were listening. As I made my way back toward the RV, I heard something faint, a low, haunting hum that seemed to drift through the trees. I stopped, straining to listen, my heart picking up its pace. It was beautiful. Like the wind itself was singing, a melody of soft, flowing notes blending together. The sound tugged at something deep inside me, a curiosity I couldn't ignore. I knew this had to be the song people spoke of, the mysterious sound that kept locals away. But I wasn't afraid. I felt enchanted. The melody faded, leaving me with a sense of longing. My heart ached to hear it again, and I felt a thrill at the thought of following the sound, of uncovering the source. I shook myself, reminding myself of my rational mind. But as I lay in bed that night, the song's echoes danced through my mind, stirring a restless curiosity that would not leave. The next night, I waited by the RV, hoping the song would return. I wasn't disappointed. Just past midnight, the melody began again, drifting from deep within the forest, a faint, almost mournful tune that seemed to wrap around me, calling me forward. I grabbed my flashlight, feeling an inexplicable need to find the source. I knew it was foolish, but the song had a magnetic pull, a beauty I couldn't resist. I ventured down the trail, feeling the cool night air prickling against my skin as I moved deeper into the darkness. The melody grew clearer, weaving through the trees, leading me farther from the RV. I didn't bother marking my way back. I didn't want to lose focus on the song. The trail twisted, winding deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser, their shadows thicker. At one point, I stopped, realizing I'd lost track of time. The melody had faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. I turned, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was only the forest, the towering pines stretching upward into the darkness. As I turned to head back, the song returned, softer and sweeter, urging me forward. I found myself moving toward it again, almost as if in a trance, following the twisting path deeper into the forest until I reached a clearing. The trees opened up around me, revealing an ancient grove. The air felt different here, heavier, charged. The trees were enormous, their twisted trunks blackened with age, their bark rough and knotted. At the center of the grove was a circle of totems, tall and weathered, each one carved with strange, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right at me. I shivered, feeling their gaze. The song was louder here, more beautiful, but laced with an eerie, sorrowful quality, as if the forest itself was grieving. I moved closer to one of the totems, studying its face. The hollow eyes, the deep lines etched into the wood. It was unsettlingly lifelike. There was something ancient about this place, something that felt both sacred and dangerous. I wanted to leave, but something held me there, an invisible thread that I couldn't break. The song grew louder, more urgent, and I felt a sudden dizziness, my vision blurring as I stumbled back, struggling to catch my breath. Who's there?" I whispered, feeling foolish but needing to break the silence. There was no answer, only the song echoing around me, filling my mind, weaving into my thoughts. I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, like I'd been here before, though I knew that was impossible. As I turned to leave, the forest shifted, the trees seeming to close in, their branches stretching toward me like skeletal arms. I tried to follow the trail back, but every path led me in circles, back to the grove, back to the totems with their hollow, accusing eyes. Panic set in. I was lost, trapped, and the song was no longer beautiful. It was a mournful wail, piercing my mind, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I had become part of the forest's twisted cycle. I ran, desperate to find my way out, my flashlight flickering as I stumbled through the darkness. But no matter where I turned, the trees closed in, the totems always watching, always there, as if they were following me. I was exhausted, my body aching, my mind numb with fear. I collapsed back in the grove, the totems standing around me like silent sentinels, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The song had softened, its melody slow and mournful, as if the forest was waiting for something. In a moment of clarity, I remembered an old superstition about leaving behind a personal item to appease restless spirits. Desperation drove me as I pulled off my wedding ring, the one connection I still had to my past life, my identity. My heart pounded as I placed it at the foot of one of the totems, whispering a plea. "Please, let me go." The song stopped. Silence fell over the grove, thick and oppressive. I held my breath, waiting, hoping, and then the trees seemed to shift, parting to reveal a path leading out of the grove. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky, my mind still foggy as I followed the path, my flashlight illuminating the way. I didn't look back, didn't dare to, fearing that the totems would be there, waiting. When I finally emerged from the forest, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I staggered back to the RV, barely able to breathe, feeling a strange sense of loss as I climbed inside. I drove away without looking back, not wanting to see what might be lurking in the shadows of the trees. As I left Silent Pines behind, I felt an eerie calm settle over me, a bittersweet relief. I hadn't found what I was looking for, but I'd found something else, a choice, a reminder of what it meant to be alive. Later, as I sorted through my notes, I found an entry I didn't remember writing. Scrawled in my own handwriting, it read, "Leave something behind, or become part of the forest." The words sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't written that. But as I drove farther from the forest, I felt a strange peace, a sense that the grove had let me go, that I'd been given a second chance. And yet, in the back of my mind, I could still see the hollow eyes of the totems, watching, waiting. I knew I'd left something behind, a part of me that would always belong to Silent Pines. And as I looked in the rearview mirror, I thought, just for a second, that I saw my own face staring back at me from the trees, carved into the wood, hollow-eyed and waiting. I didn't stop driving. I'd always been drawn to haunted places. As a writer, I thrived on the mystery, the legends, and the thrill of a place with dark history. The Pine Barrens had always been on my list, with tales of the Jersey Devil and whispered accounts of strange disappearances. So, when I finally set up my RV at the edge of the forest, I was hoping for a little inspiration, a spark to pull me out of my creative slump. That first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I sat outside, watching the treetops sway in the wind. But there were no crickets, no rustling animals, just an odd stillness that hung in the air like fog. The deeper the night grew, the more it felt like the silence was alive, closing in around me. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to being alone, but that instinctive unease was hard to ignore. As I sat there, staring into the trees, I saw something. A faint glint, like moonlight reflecting off stone. My curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed my flashlight, following the beam of light deeper into the woods. That's when I found it. It was a stone archway, old and covered in moss. The stones were cracked, the structure just barely holding together, but there was something almost mesmerizing about it. Strange symbols, carved into the stone and worn smooth by time, seemed to pulse in the moonlight. It wasn't on any map, and part of me knew better than to get too close, but I'd never been one to back down from a mystery. I stepped through the archway, feeling a shiver run down my spine the moment I crossed the threshold. The air changed, growing colder, heavier, like I'd walked through an invisible curtain. The forest looked the same, but there was an unnatural darkness now, a shadow that seemed to linger on every branch, every tree trunk. As I turned to head back, a faint sound drifted through the trees, a whisper, low and chilling, like someone calling my name. I shook my head, trying to ignore the prickling fear creeping into my mind. I was just tired. It had to be my imagination. But the further I walked, the stranger things became. I made it back to the RV, but it looked different. At first, I couldn't place it, but as I climbed inside, I noticed things were out of order. My books were scattered on the floor, the curtains were drawn, even though I'd left them open, and a chill filled the air despite the windows being closed. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was just an effect of the cold night air. But then I noticed something on the table. It was a piece of paper, ragged at the edges with faint pencil marks across it. My heart skipped a beat as I picked it up, reading the single line written in messy, hurried handwriting. If you see yourself, don't follow. My hands trembled. I didn't recognize the handwriting, but something about it felt familiar. I scanned the RV, looking for some explanation, but everything was silent. The warning echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing second. I didn't understand it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. The next morning, things only grew worse. I stepped outside, hoping the daylight would make everything feel normal again. But the world outside seemed different, like someone had taken the forest and painted over it with shadows. The trees seemed darker, their trunks twisted in strange ways, their branches stretching out like skeletal arms. And the silence. It was even heavier in the daylight, a silence that pressed against my ears, blocking out every other sound. I wandered back toward the archway, hoping to make sense of what had happened. But as I walked, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There, just off the path, stood another figure. It was a man, standing between the trees, watching me. My breath hitched as I squinted, trying to make out his face. But as he stepped closer, I realized with a shock of terror that he looked exactly like me. The man, my double, stood perfectly still, his face expressionless, his eyes dark and hollow. He wore my clothes, the same jacket and boots I was wearing, but something was wrong. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his face was twisted in a way that didn't look quite human, as if someone had painted an imitation of me from memory. I took a step back, the warning on the note flashing through my mind. If you see yourself, don't follow. The figure cocked its head, its mouth stretching into a smile that felt more like a grimace. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, refusing to break eye contact, but when I blinked, he was gone. I tried to leave the forest that afternoon, but no matter which direction I turned, I kept ending up at the same place, the stone archway. The air felt thicker, as though it was pressing in on me, and the shadows grew longer, distorting everything around me. I returned to the RV, desperate to gather my thoughts, but the strangeness inside had only deepened. My belongings had shifted again, as if someone had rifled through them. And then I saw it. Another note, left on my bed, the same jagged handwriting scrawled across it. You're almost there. I ripped up the note, heart hammering, but I couldn't ignore the truth clawing its way into my mind. Something was playing with me. The archway had led me somewhere I wasn't meant to be, into a world that looked like my own, but was warped, wrong, and inhabited by something else. And that night, as I sat alone, I felt that thing watching me. The whispers came first, low, barely audible, like 1,000 voices murmuring in unison. Then came the footsteps, soft and shuffling like someone pacing outside the RV. I peered out the window, flashlight in hand, and caught a glimpse of movement. Another figure, identical to the one I'd seen earlier. It was me again, standing just outside the RV, his eyes fixed on mine through the glass. But this time he wasn't alone. Other figures joined him, stepping out of the shadows one by one. Each of them looked like me, distorted, twisted, their faces blank and hollow-eyed, their mouths stretching into eerie, unnatural smiles. They surrounded the RV, watching, waiting. My hands shook as I locked the door, but deep down, I knew locks wouldn't help. They were everywhere, these shadow versions of me, standing like silent sentinels, their hollow eyes staring through the windows, watching me with an intensity that felt suffocating. And then, as one, they began to whisper, "Let go, Luke, let go." Their voices filled the RV, echoing through the walls, growing louder until I thought I would go mad. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voices only grew, pulsing in my mind, seeping into my thoughts. "Let go," they whispered, their voices overlapping, becoming a chant. "Accept your place." In a surge of desperation, I threw open the door and ran, stumbling through the trees, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away from the RV, away from those twisted, soulless versions of myself. And then, through the shadows, I saw it. The archway. It stood there, looming in the darkness, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I felt a pull, a sense that if I crossed through it again, I might escape this nightmare. But just as I approached, my doppelganger appeared again, blocking my path. He was closer now, his face inches from mine, his hollow eyes empty, yet somehow filled with a quiet, mocking knowledge. "Let go, Luke," he murmured in my own voice, a twisted echo that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're already home." I stumbled backward, terror seizing me, but the figure grabbed my arm, his grip ice-cold and unyielding. For a brief moment, our faces were inches apart, and I felt as if I were staring into a mirror reflecting my worst fears back at me. With a final surge of desperation, I tore myself free and lunged through the archway. The world shifted, the air warming as if I'd emerged from a shadow. I stumbled out into the forest, gasping for breath, the familiar landscape bathed in early morning light. The whispers were gone, the silence replaced by the gentle sounds of birdsong. I was back. But as I made my way to the RV, a flicker of movement caught my eye. In the rearview mirror, just for a moment, I saw him again, my reflection, staring back at me from the shadows of the archway, his hollow eyes filled with something dark and unrelenting, and I knew that he was still there, waiting, just on the other side of the veil. And someday he'd find a way back. There's a reason Redwood Pass is barely marked on maps. The locals say it's haunted, and when I mentioned the place at a gas station, the guy behind the counter just shook his head. "Wouldn't go up there if I were you," he muttered, ringing up my coffee. "Some people, they don't come back." I laughed it off, nodding as if I believed him, but I didn't. I'm a travel journalist after all, and I've spent my career chasing the paranormal, always finding some ordinary explanation hiding under layers of superstition. The ghost of Redwood Pass would be just another story to debunk. But that was before I got there. The road to the pass was narrow, winding, and lined with dense, towering redwoods that rose high enough to block out the sky. The further I drove, the heavier the air felt, and before long, a thick fog began to roll in. I watched it gather in the mirror, creeping over the road like a gray ocean wave. Then, in the rear view, I saw a shadow. It was faint at first, a blur at the edge of my vision, vaguely human-shaped. But as I drove, the figure grew clearer, standing at the edge of the road, facing my RV. I glanced over my shoulder, but when I looked back, it was gone. I chuckled nervously, blaming the fog, the winding road, maybe even my caffeine withdrawal. Still, my fingers tightened around the wheel. When I finally parked at the base of the pass, the fog was thick, and the only sound was the rustle of wind through the trees. I stepped out, the scent of damp pine filling my lungs, but something about it felt wrong, oppressive. I'd read about the ghostly figure people saw around here. They called it the Watcher of Redwood Pass, said it appeared in mirrors and windows, luring travelers off the road, deeper into the woods. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The fog thickened as the day went on, strange for a sunny afternoon in Northern California. I set up camp beside the RV, telling myself I'd just do one night here, enough to gather some notes and take a few pictures for the article. I checked my phone and watch, but the times didn't match. My phone said it was noon. My watch claimed it was nearly 3. I chalked it up to a glitch, though my stomach was twisting. Around dusk, the whispers started. They were faint at first, like the sound of the wind brushing through the trees, but they grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were circling me. I heard my name drifting through the fog, soft but unmistakable. Jack. The voice was low, almost a murmur, but I could swear it came from just beyond the tree line. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. I heard no answer, only the rustling of leaves. And yet, I knew I wasn't alone. That night, I sat in the RV, writing down my notes in a futile attempt to keep myself calm. But as the hours passed, the fog closed in, pressing against the windows. I kept glancing at my reflection, feeling the weight of someone else's gaze. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned, heart pounding, and saw a face in the passenger side mirror. It was faint, a dark silhouette with blurred features, but it was watching me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I gasped, and it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I shut my notebook, breathing heavily, trying to rationalize. It was just a trick of the fog, a play of shadows, but every instinct in me screamed that something else was at work. I forced myself to look away, staring at the ground, trying to clear my head. When I looked back, my reflection seemed different. Gaunt, eyes hollow, skin stretched tight, as though the face staring back wasn't mine at all. I stumbled back, feeling a chill race down my spine. The next morning, I decided to leave. I didn't need to debunk anything. I just needed to get out of Redwood Pass. I threw my things into my bag, but as I reached for the RV keys, I froze. The fog was even thicker than before, completely obscuring the road. It hung over the trees like a shroud, muting every sound except my own shaky breathing. I stepped outside, hoping the fresh air would calm me, but the quiet was worse than I'd expected. It was as if the whole world had been muffled, and the only sound was the distant whisper of my name. Jack. My heart raced as I turned, scanning the trees looking for the source of the voice, but no one was there. Then I heard it again, closer this time, echoing through the fog. My hands shook as I clutched the keys, my mind spinning with 1,000 explanations. I took a step toward the road, determined to leave, but something in the fog moved, catching my attention. A shadowy figure, vaguely human, stood at the edge of the clearing, just visible in the mist. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make out the figure's features, but the fog distorted everything, turning it into a blur of darkness and hollow eyes. It lifted a hand, beckoning, its voice carrying through the fog in a soft, haunting whisper. Come, join us. I stumbled back, heart hammering, desperate to get away. I turned and ran back to the RV, But no matter how fast I moved, every path led me in circles, back to that same spot. I was trapped, the fog thickening around me, closing in, as if the forest itself was swallowing me whole. The day stretched into a feverish blur, and by dusk, I was no closer to finding a way out. My GPS was useless, and my phone displayed random times, each more improbable than the last. It was as though the past existed outside of time, an endless loop that twisted around me, keeping me prisoner. As night fell, I saw the Watcher again. It was clear this time, standing just a few feet from the RV, its face gaunt, hollow, almost human but wrong, like a shadow that had worn the same form for too long. Its eyes glowed faintly, and as I watched, it tilted its head, studying me. I backed away, clutching my flashlight, feeling like a child afraid of the dark. My heart pounded as I realized the Watcher was holding something, a cracked, water-stained letter, just like the one I'd found in the crevice of my RV earlier. I stepped closer, compelled by some horrible curiosity, and read the faded words scrawled across the paper. "The Watcher only leaves if you do." I felt a rush of panic, a desperate urge to leave, to escape this nightmare. But as I turned to run, the Watcher stepped forward, blocking my path, its hollow eyes fixed on me. In the reflection of the RV's window, I saw myself, older, worn, my own eyes as hollow as the Watcher's. I screamed, stumbling back, but the Watcher's face twisted into a dark, twisted grin. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice low and mocking. "You're already part of Redwood Pass." In a frenzy, I turned and smashed the side mirror with my flashlight, shattering the reflection, hoping that somehow I could break its hold on me. The Watcher's image flickered, its form wavering, but it didn't disappear. "You can't escape," it whispered, fading into the fog. "Redwood Pass doesn't let go." I was breathing hard, my mind reeling, but I forced myself to focus. My mother's last words echoed in my mind about making peace with ghosts. Maybe that was the only way out. Ignoring the whispers, the reflections, the shadowy figures that seemed to crowd the edges of my vision, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I remembered my mother, her voice calm, her presence steady. I let the memory of her guide me, drowning out the voices, the fear. And then, like magic, the fog began to lift. The whispers faded, and the forest seemed to retreat, giving way to a narrow path that led to the main road. My heart swelled with relief as I followed it, step by step, until I reached the edge of the pass. When I got back to my RV, I started the engine, almost weeping with relief when it roared to life. I drove away from Redwood Pass without looking back, my hands shaking, the weight of the experience pressing down on me like a heavy fog I couldn't shake. Months later, I wrote an article about my night in Redwood Pass, detailing the whispers, the Watcher, the haunting experience. But some details I kept to myself. The way my own reflection had morphed into the Watcher's, the way I'd felt it watching me even as I left. I thought I'd escaped, but late at night, I still see it. The shadow lingering in my rearview mirror, the faint whisper of my name. I don't know if it's real or if it's Redwood Pass playing tricks on my mind. But I know one thing, Redwood Pass never really lets go. I'd heard whispers about it before. A lake hidden deep in the Adirondacks, an untouched place where the water was so still, so clear, it was like staring into a perfect mirror. It was called Mirror Lake, and locals claimed it held strange powers, that it could show you things, your deepest desires. your worst regrets. I didn't believe any of it, of course, but as a photographer, the idea of a place like that was too good to resist. So there I was, setting up camp on its shore, the only sound the quiet rustling of trees and the occasional bird call. It was beautiful, yes, but unsettling in its stillness. The lake stretched out before me, so calm it looked like glass. I was alone, and that was just how I wanted it. Just me, my camera, and this strange, perfect lake. The first night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I barely slept, watching as the lake's reflection turned silver under the moonlight. I saw stars shining in the water, brighter than in the sky, and I could swear that the air around the lake was heavier, as if it were pressing down on me. I brushed it off. I was there for one reason, to capture the perfect photo, one that would capture the lake's beauty, its mystery. Maybe it would be the shot that would finally put my life back on track. The next morning, I woke at dawn, grabbing my camera and heading to the shore. The mist drifted over the water, delicate and surreal, making the whole lake look like it was floating in another world. But as I looked down at my reflection, my stomach twisted. My face stared back at me, but something wasn't right. My reflection was wearing a slight smile that I wasn't. I tilted my head to one side, but the reflection moved a fraction of a second too slowly, its gaze lingering on me with an intensity that felt unnatural. "Just a trick of the light," I muttered, snapping a photo and stepping back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from within that water. That night, I sat in my RV, trying to focus on reviewing the photos. But when I pulled up the shots from that morning, my heart skipped a beat. The pictures didn't look the way I remembered them. They were darker, the colors muted, with shadows stretching out from my reflection in ways that didn't make sense. It was as if the lake had reached out from the water, pulling the shadows toward it. I scrolled through the photos, each one more distorted than the last. And in the final shot, I saw her. My ex-wife, Sarah. Her face reflected in the lake just behind my shoulder, her eyes staring back at me with a look I hadn't seen in years. I shut the laptop, my hands shaking. It couldn't have been real. She wasn't here. She couldn't be. We hadn't spoken since the divorce, hadn't even seen each other. But her face, her reflection had been right there, as clear as day. I told myself I'd just been tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the night wore on, I kept seeing her face in my mind, the way she looked at me in the water, almost longing. By midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the RV, drawn back to the lake as if something had hooked me by the chest and was pulling me forward. The air was thick, still, and a strange fog had settled over the water, swirling like smoke. I stepped to the edge, peering down at the dark surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Just my reflection, staring back, the flashlight beam casting a faint glow. But then she appeared. Her face rippled into view beside mine, her expression soft and sad. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out, only the faint echo of her voice drifting up from the water. "Ethan, come back!" I stumbled back, heart pounding, but my feet refused to move. I was rooted there, mesmerized by her reflection, by the way she looked at me like she was still mine. "Come back," she whispered again, her voice clear this time like a gentle melody. "You don't have to be alone anymore." The pain of our breakup flooded back to me, raw and sharp. The arguments, the distance that had grown between us, until it felt like we were strangers. I'd thought I could move on, thought I'd buried those feelings. But standing there, looking at her reflection, I realized just how deep they still ran. Without thinking, I reached out, fingers grazing the water's surface. It was icy cold, sending a shock through my arm, but I couldn't pull away. Her hand rose from the water, reaching out to me, and before I knew it, I was leaning forward, my hand moving toward hers, fingertips just inches apart. Then, in an instant, her face twisted. Her eyes darkened, her mouth stretching into a wide, eerie grin. The reflection wasn't Sarah anymore. It was something else, something wearing her face like a mask. "Come back, Ethan," she repeated, but her voice was mocking now, cold and hollow. "Come to me." I stumbled back, nearly falling into the lake. My heart thundered as I ran back to the RV, locking the door behind me. But I could still feel her, feel the weight of her gaze, the pull of her voice echoing in my mind. The next morning, I tried to leave. I packed everything up, threw my camera in the bag, and started the RV. But no matter which road I took, no matter how many turns I made, every path led me back to the lake. I'd drive for miles, only to find myself parked at the shore, the water stretching out before me, still and silent. Frustrated and desperate, I finally gave up, parking the RV and sitting at the edge of the water. I stared down at the lake, its perfect mirror surface holding my gaze. And then, I saw him. A figure stood across the lake, half hidden by the mist. He looked just like me, but older, his face worn and gaunt. His eyes were vacant, staring back at me with a strange, haunted look. I froze, my heart pounding. It was like looking at a reflection of the future, a future where I never escaped this place, a future where I was trapped, just another ghost on the lake. And then he spoke. "Come back, Ethan," he murmured, his voice distant, hollow. "You know you want to." I backed away, stumbling, but his voice grew louder, echoing in my mind. "You know you belong here," he whispered, a strange, empty smile stretching across his face. "Come back to me." For days, the lake refused to let me leave. Every attempt to drive away, every path I took, somehow brought me back to its shore. I began to lose track of time, my memories slipping away, replaced by visions of Sarah, her face smiling at me from the lake, calling me back to her. I stopped sleeping, the voices keeping me awake, whispering through the walls of the RV, telling me I didn't have to be alone, that all I had to do was let go. And each night, I would find myself back at the water's edge, staring down at my reflection. But the face that stared back wasn't always mine. Sometimes it was her. Sometimes it was the older version of myself, hollow and broken. One night, I saw them both, standing beside me in the water, their hands reaching up to me, their eyes filled with something dark and unending. "Come back to us, Ethan," they whispered, their voices blending into one. "It's time to come home." I wanted to scream, to run, but the pull was too strong. Their faces blurred, twisting, becoming one as the lake called to me, pulling me deeper, deeper. On the final morning, I realized what I had to do. I stood at the lake's edge, staring down at the still, dark water. My reflection looked back at me, calm and quiet, as if waiting. "You're not real," I whispered, my voice trembling. "None of this is real." The reflection smiled, that same hollow smile, and for the first time I felt myself smile back. "I'm letting you go," I whispered, my hands clenching at my sides, I'm done. The reflection's face twisted, rage flashing in its eyes, but I held my ground. I turned away, refusing to look back, forcing myself to walk away from the lake step by step. As I reached the RV, I could feel the weight lifting, the fog clearing from my mind. The voices faded, replaced by the faint, distant call of birdsong. I drove away, the lake vanishing in my rearview mirror, and for the first time, I felt a strange sense of peace. I knew I'd left something behind, a part of myself that had been tied to the lake, to my regrets, to her. And though I'd escaped, I knew that part of me would always be there, waiting, just beneath the surface of the water, a reflection of the man I could have become. I would never return to Mirror Lake, but every now and then, in a still pool of water or a reflection in a window, I see them. Her face, my own haunted gaze, watching, calling, and I know that someday they'll try to call me back. The Pinewood Rest campground hadn't seen a visitor in a decade, and for good reason. The place was empty, abandoned, a shell of the vibrant camping site it once was. I'd worked here years ago as a young forest ranger, but things had changed since then. Even I could feel it in the air, a heaviness that clung to the trees and seemed to hold its breath. Maybe I should have listened to that feeling and turned back. But that wasn't why I was here. I was here to confront something I'd buried for far too long. Years ago, I'd made a terrible mistake while working as a ranger. A hiker had died on my watch, a young guy, eager to explore, who'd put his trust in me. I made a miscalculation on the trail, and he ended up lost in a storm. I covered up my role in his death, told myself it was just a tragic accident. But the guilt never let go. I thought maybe, if I came back to the place where it all happened, I could finally find peace. I parked my RV in the middle of the empty campground. Tall pines loomed over me, their branches swaying in a soft breeze that carried the scent of moss and damp earth. I'd barely stepped outside when I felt it. The eerie silence. No birds, no rustling of animals, just the wind whispering through the trees, as if the whole place were waiting. As I explored the campsite, memories flooded back. I saw the fire pit where campers once roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories, the weathered picnic tables, even a few scattered beer cans from God knows when. But the thing that struck me the most was the sense that the place hadn't been empty for as long as they said. An empty water bottle lay half buried near a tree, and there were scraps of cloth snagged on a bush. My heart started to beat faster, but I forced myself to keep walking, hoping to shake the sense of being watched. That night, I sat by a small fire, sipping coffee and listening to the woods around me. The trees were barely visible in the darkness, their shadows creeping across the ground like reaching fingers. As the fire crackled, I thought I heard footsteps, soft, slow, circling me. I held my breath, listening, straining to see beyond the flickering light of the fire. But there was nothing. Just my imagination, I told myself. This place was playing tricks on me. I stood up, deciding to check the perimeter of the campsite. But as I walked around, I found something scratched into the trunk of a tree near the RV. Words, crude and faint, as if written by someone in a hurry. Help me. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back. It wasn't possible. No one else was out here. I hadn't seen another vehicle, hadn't heard a single sound of human life since I arrived. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the shadows, but there was nothing. I laughed, a nervous, hollow sound, and told myself it was probably an old prank, something left from years ago. But the words burned in my mind, as if someone had written them just for me. As the night wore on, sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear faint whispers, my name drifting through the air carried on the wind. And then there were the footsteps, always just beyond the circle of light, never getting closer but never going away. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. I told myself it was just the sounds of the woods, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This was something else. Sometime after midnight, I drifted off, only to be jerked awake by a loud bang against the side of the RV. I bolted upright, my breath coming in gasps. I scrambled for my flashlight, heart racing, and shone it out the window. Nothing. But when I stepped outside to check, I saw them. Fresh footprints in the mud leading around the RV. They were deep, too deep to be from anything other than boots, and they circled the RV twice before stopping at the door. A chill ran down my spine as I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing in the darkness, watching me. But I was alone, or so I thought. The next morning, I decided to leave. I'd had enough of the whispers, the footsteps, and the feeling of being watched. But when I got to the RV, I found both rear tires slashed, deep gashes cutting through the rubber. My hands shook as I ran my fingers over the cuts. They were fresh, like someone had done it during the night. I looked around, scanning the trees, the ground, every shadow. But there was no sign of anyone. With my phone in hand, I tried to call for help, only to find there was no signal. I climbed up the ridge a little, hoping to catch a bar, but the reception was dead, as if something was blocking it. Panic settled in the pit of my stomach, heavy and cold. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it. A voice calling my name. Hank? It was soft, barely a whisper, but I'd recognize that voice anywhere. It was him, the hiker. My mind reeled, memories flashing back to the stormy night I'd lost him on the trail. His terrified eyes as he realized we were off course, the way he'd looked at me, desperate for reassurance. Hank, why didn't you help me? The voice came again, louder this time. I stumbled backward, clutching my head, squeezing my eyes shut. No, I muttered. You're gone. You're not here. But when I opened my eyes, I saw him standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in shadow. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, his mouth twisted in a mixture of anger and sorrow. You left me, he said, his voice carrying on the wind. You promised you'd help, but you left. The guilt I'd buried for so long hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the breath out of me. I backed away, shaking my head, tears burning in my eyes. I'm sorry, I whispered, but he was gone, disappearing into the shadows like he'd never been there. The haunting intensified after that. Every step I took, I felt his presence, felt his eyes on me, heard his footsteps echoing mine. I tried to escape, but every path I took seemed to twist back around, leading me right back to the abandoned campground. Time began to slip away, minutes bleeding into hours, hours into an eternity. My watch stopped ticking, and every time I glanced at it, the hands were frozen. I couldn't remember what day it was. Couldn't tell if it was morning or evening. It was as if the forest itself had trapped me, refusing to let me leave. At night, I heard the whispers again, louder, more insistent. They filled the air, pressing down on me, accusing, demanding. Why didn't you save me, Hank? Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Driven by desperation, I followed the voice into the forest, stumbling through the undergrowth, my flashlight flickering in the darkness. There, in a small clearing, I saw him, the hiker, fully formed, standing beneath the moonlight, his face twisted in agony. His clothes were torn, his skin pale as death, his eyes hollow and accusing. "Tell me why," he demanded, his voice thick with pain. "Why did you leave me?" I fell to my knees, the weight of my guilt crushing me. "I was scared," I admitted, my voice shaking. "I panicked. I didn't know what to do, and I left you. I should have saved you, but I didn't. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable, and then, slowly, his face softened. He looked almost peaceful. The woods around me grew silent, and I felt a strange, calming presence settle over me. The shadows lifted, the whispers faded, and I knew somehow that he'd forgiven me. When I returned to the campsite, the dawn was breaking. The RV tires were fixed, my phone had a signal, and the woods no longer felt oppressive. I climbed into the driver's seat, glancing back at the forest one last time. At the edge of the trees, I saw a faint figure watching me, his face calm, a faint smile on his lips. He lifted a hand in a silent farewell before disappearing into the mist. As I drove away, I felt a weight lift from my chest, the guilt that had haunted me for years finally fading. But a part of me knew I'd never forget him, never truly escape the shadows of Pinewood Rest, because some things can never be left behind. I came to the Mojave Desert to escape. I thought the silence, the stark, endless landscape would help clear my mind, give me some sort of answer about what my life was supposed to be. I'd walked away from a high-paying job, sold my apartment, and rented an RV, determined to find a simpler life. But alone in the desert, with nothing but endless sand and rocks in every direction, I was starting to wonder if I'd made the right choice. It was my third day in the desert, and the isolation was starting to weigh on me. The only sounds were the dry wind whistling through the rocks and the occasional rustle of sand. I tried to convince myself I liked the quiet, that I'd needed it. But as I sat outside my RV that night, staring up at a sky blanketed with stars, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that I wasn't really alone. And then I saw it. Across a stretch of cracked desert earth, partially hidden by a rocky outcrop, sat another RV. I squinted through the dim twilight. It was the same make and model as mine, parked in the middle of nowhere, seemingly abandoned. I couldn't see anyone around it, no signs of life. The door hung slightly open, like an invitation. I hesitated. A sensible part of me said to ignore it, maybe even drive somewhere else. But curiosity got the best of me. I walked over, my boots crunching in the sand, every step echoing in the silence. When I reached the RV, I noticed the similarities. It wasn't just the same model. It had the same color, the same dents and scratches in the same places. A chill ran through me as I looked closer. This wasn't just a similar RV. It was identical. I peeked inside, half expecting to see myself sitting there. Instead, I found an empty space, stale with the smell of must and dust, like no one had stepped inside for years. The interior was nearly identical to my own, except for one thing. On a small, dusty table sat a notebook. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was frantic, messy. Most of the entries were nearly illegible, but a few words stood out. Trapped. No escape. Was it a mistake? Did I ruin my life? My heart pounded as I read. These were the questions I'd been asking myself since I'd left my job. I flipped to the next page and saw another entry that hit closer to home. Who am I now? Am I really anyone without that life? It was like reading my own thoughts laid bare in someone else's handwriting. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, faint at first but growing louder. It sounded like it was coming from the RV itself. I backed away, clutching the notebook, and turned to head back to my own RV, feeling a creeping sense of dread. That night, I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words from the notebook. They echoed in my mind, amplifying the doubts that had been gnawing at me since I left my old life behind. Around midnight, I heard something, a soft whisper coming from outside the RV. I sat up, my heart racing. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. A murmur, just loud enough to make out a few words. "Tyler, come back." I froze, a shiver creeping down my spine. The voice sounded like mine, distorted, echoing, like it was calling to me from a distance. I gripped the edges of my blanket, feeling the chill seep through me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Just the desert and the cold night air pressing in around me. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come. The quiet of the desert felt thicker, heavier, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. The next morning, I tried to leave. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and that other RV. I started the engine, my mind set on finding a new spot, but my GPS refused to load, stuck on a single point. I checked my phone, but it was dead, even though I'd charged it the night before. I decided to rely on my instincts, hoping the road would lead me back to the main highway. But every turn seemed to loop me back to the same spot, the same stretch of desert. No matter how many times I turned around, the rocky outcrop with the abandoned RV loomed in the distance like a mirage that refused to disappear. Frustrated, I parked and got out, staring across the desert at that empty RV. It felt like it was mocking me, like it was waiting for me to return. Against my better judgment, I walked back over, telling myself I'd missed something, some sign of who it belonged to, or why it was there. When I opened the door this time, I found something different. A mirror had been placed against the wall inside. I hadn't noticed it before, but it was cracked, splintering my reflection into jagged pieces. As I looked into it, I felt a strange disconnect, like the face staring back wasn't really mine. And then my reflection smiled. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The reflection raised its hand, even though mine stayed at my side, its movements jerky and distorted, like a puppet on invisible strings. "You're running from yourself, Tyler," it whispered, the voice warped, echoing inside my head. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "This isn't real. You're not real." "Oh, but I am. I'm the part of you that you left behind. The part that still wants the life you walked away from. The part that knows you made a mistake." My mouth was dry, my pulse racing. I wanted to leave, to run, but I felt rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the mirror. The reflection leaned closer, its expression darkening. Did you really think you could escape yourself? That by coming out here you'd just figure it all out? You're not made for this. You're not strong enough. You'll always be the man who ran." "Stop it," I whispered, clenching my fists. "You're just a reflection. You're not real." It laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Oh, I'm very real, and I'm not going anywhere." The reflection raised its hand, pressing it against the glass, and I felt a strange pull, like it was trying to drag me forward, into the mirror, into that other RV. I stumbled back, breaking eye contact, and the pull faded, leaving me gasping for air. I bolted out of the RV, slamming the door behind me. I raced back to my own RV, started the engine, and sped down the dusty path, not caring if I was going in circles. I just needed to get away. But every road seemed to lead me back. Every turn brought me closer to that cursed RV, sitting there like a mirror image of my own, waiting for me to return. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind whispered my name. I lay in bed, clutching the notebook, reading the final entry over and over. There's no escape. This place, it's a prison of my own making. A low hum filled the air, and I realized it was coming from my own RV this time. I turned to the window, and in the dim light, I saw a figure standing outside. It was me. I stared, heart pounding, as the figure raised a hand, mirroring my own movements. It mouthed the words, "Come back," its voice faint, almost pleading. I wanted to look away, but I felt drawn to it, a part of me desperate to understand what it wanted, why it looked so much like me. "You don't belong out here," the figure whispered, its voice hollow and distant. "You'll never find what you're looking for. You'll only find yourself." I felt a chill creep through me, an icy dread that settled deep in my bones. I shut the curtains, my heart racing, and sat in the silence, trying to convince myself that it was just a hallucination, just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I sat there, I heard the faint sound of laughter echoing through the night, and I knew, deep down, that I'd never be alone again. The next morning, I finally found my way out of the desert, but I felt changed, haunted by the memory of that mirror image, that empty RV that was somehow me. Even back in the city, I'd catch glimpses of my reflection in windows, in mirrors, in darkened screens, and I'd see it. That shadow self, staring back at me with hollow eyes, waiting for me to return to the desert. And sometimes, when the nights are quiet and still, I hear it calling, a whisper from somewhere deep inside. "Come back, Tyler. Come back." And some part of me wants to answer. The old mining town of Burrow Creek sat under the desert's vast, cloudless sky, decaying like a forgotten memory. I'd taken my RV down a back road after stumbling on a local bar in the last town, where the bartender had spoken in hushed tones about the ghost lights of Burrow Creek. "You're curious about the strange lights, aren't you?" she had asked, a hint of a smile on her lips. "Folks say they're the souls of miners, lost and wandering. They only come out for those with sorrow heavy enough to match their own." I didn't tell her I'd lost my wife, or that I'd been on the road ever since, looking for some spark of meaning. I just nodded, paid my tab, and drove toward Burrow Creek, thinking it was just another ghost town. But as the RV creaked to a stop on the outskirts, I was struck by the stillness, an eerie quiet that wrapped around the town like a fog. The empty buildings loomed, casting long shadows in the fading evening light. I could see the remains of what once might have been a bustling street. Crumbling storefronts, a saloon with its sign hanging by a single chain, and the faint outlines of windows peering out like hollow eyes. I parked the RV by the road and stepped outside, feeling a strange pull to explore. Maybe, I thought, it was just the allure of an abandoned place. But deep down, I knew I was hoping to feel something, to forget the emptiness that had followed me since my wife passed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a cold chill settled over the town. That's when I saw it. The first light. It was faint, just a flicker in the distance, hovering by an old well near the center of town. At first, I thought it was someone with a lantern, but the light didn't move naturally. It drifted like a firefly caught in a breeze, bobbing in place. I walked toward it, my steps echoing in the quiet. The light danced closer, pulsing softly, and as I neared, I saw it wasn't a lantern at all. It was a ghostly, bluish glow floating about a foot above the ground, illuminating nothing but itself. A shiver ran down my spine. The air grew colder, and as I reached out instinctively, the light drifted away, almost as if it were beckoning me to follow. I hesitated, but my legs moved on their own. The light led me through the empty streets, winding between buildings, past the cracked, weathered facades, and toward the heart of Burrow Creek. I felt a strange pull, a tugging in my chest that made my heart ache in a way I hadn't felt since I lost her. As I followed, other lights began to appear, one by one, hovering by old buildings, drifting down alleys, weaving between the shadows. They pulsed gently, filling the town with an unearthly glow, casting long shadows that twisted and shifted as if they were alive. Then I heard it, a faint whisper. "David?" I stopped, my heart pounding, the blood rushing in my ears. I hadn't heard anyone say my name in weeks, not since I left my life behind to roam the back roads. But the voice was unmistakable, soft and warm. It was hers, Emily's. I turned, searching the darkness, and there she was, standing in a doorway just ahead, half shrouded in shadow. Emily, just as I remembered her hair catching the glow of the lights, her eyes fixed on me with that gentle smile I'd missed so much. "Emily?" I whispered, disbelief making my voice shake. She raised a hand, motioning for me to come closer. I stumbled forward, my mind racing. I knew it couldn't be real. She was gone. I'd held her hand as the light left her eyes, felt her fingers go limp, but here she was, clear as day, calling my name in that familiar, comforting tone. As I drew near, she backed into the building, disappearing into the shadows. "Wait!" I called, following her into the darkness. I found myself in what looked like an old saloon, the wooden floors warped and the walls covered in dust. The ghost lights hovered by the door, filling the room with their strange, bluish glow. And there, standing by the bar, was Emily. She smiled a soft, sorrowful smile, her eyes misty. "David, I've missed you." I reached out, my hand trembling. "Emily, how?" She didn't answer. Instead, she took my hand, her touch cold but solid, and led me to the bar, where 2 chairs sat, miraculously dust-free. We sat in silence for a moment, her hand still holding mine, her gaze soft yet filled with sadness. "I came here for you," I whispered. I couldn't stay in that house. Everywhere I looked, I saw you, and it hurt too much." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the ghostly lights. "I know, David, but you don't have to keep running." There was something in her voice, a hint of pleading that made my chest tighten. I wanted to stay with her, wanted to let go of everything that had torn me apart since she'd died. But then I looked into her eyes, and the warmth that had been there before was gone. Her gaze was hollow, empty, like two dark wells that went on forever. A chill crept over me. "Emily?" She leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Stay, David. Stay with me. Here." A sense of dread washed over me as I realized she wasn't Emily. Not really. Her face twisted, the smile stretching too wide, her eyes growing darker, deeper, as if they were pulling me in. I jerked back, my chair scraping across the floor. You're not real." The figure tilted her head, that eerie, stretched smile still frozen on her face. And as I watched, her form flickered, like a candle in the wind, fading in and out, her face twisting into other expressions, fear, anger, desperation, all worn like masks. "You can't leave, David," she whispered, her voice echoing strangely, "not until you're ready to let go." I backed away, stumbling over a broken chair, my heart pounding as I turned and bolted out of the saloon. The lights had grown brighter, filling the streets, and now I could see figures moving within them, ghostly shapes drifting in and out of view, their faces contorted with expressions of pain and sorrow. The lights began to swarm, surrounding me, their whispers filling the air, calling my name, urging me to follow. "Come back. Stay with us." The voices grew louder, overlapping, each one echoing like a distant memory. I tried to run, but the lights followed, drifting closer, their glow intensifying until they filled my vision. I could feel them pressing in, their coldness wrapping around me like a shroud. "Emily," I shouted, desperation clawing at my throat. "Please, help me." But she didn't answer. Instead, a figure appeared in the distance. A man, older, his face worn and gaunt, his eyes hollow. And as he came closer, I realized he looked just like me. The doppelganger reached out, his hand trembling. "David, it's time to let go." "No," I shouted, shaking my head. "You're not me. You're part of this place." He smiled, a sad, weary smile. "You can run, David, but you'll never escape the things you carry. They'll follow you, just like they followed me." The light swirled around him, merging into his form, casting him in an otherworldly glow. "Let go," he whispered, his voice blending with the others, the ghostly choir echoing through the town. "No," I whispered, backing away. "I'm not staying here." With a surge of determination, I turned and sprinted back to the RV, the ghost lights trailing behind me. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life, and I pulled away, the headlights cutting through the darkness as I left Burrow Creek behind. In the rearview mirror, I saw them, the lights hovering at the edge of the town, flickering softly, their glow fading as dawn broke over the desert. And just for a moment, I thought I saw her, standing among them, watching me go, her face etched with sadness. I drove for hours, the weight of what I'd seen pressing down on me. But as the sun rose, I felt something else, a strange, quiet peace. I hadn't let go of Emily, not entirely, but I knew I'd left a part of my sorrow back there, in the ghost town with the lights. And though I knew I'd never return to Burrow Creek, I could still feel the ghost lights following me, like faint memories flickering in the edges of my mind, waiting for the day I might return to the shadows. Deadwater Point, Just the name stirred up memories I'd buried for years. It was where my brother Will and I used to camp as kids, just the two of us and our fishing rods, back when we thought we'd be best friends forever. That was before everything fell apart. Now it was just me, the RV, and the weight of my memories. Will had passed away a few months back. Accident, they said. It was sudden, brutal, one of those moments you don't see coming, and when it hits like a sledgehammer. I'd been a paramedic for over a decade. I'd saved people from the brink of death, lost others right there in my arms. But when it came to Will, there was nothing I could do. That guilt had taken root in me, and I hadn't found a way to shake it. Coming to Deadwater Point was supposed to help, a kind of ritual, I told myself, to say goodbye, to find closure. But deep down, I didn't know if closure was something I'd ever get. The campground was just as I remembered it, empty, foggy, with that same thick silence that somehow managed to be louder than any sound. There were no other campers in sight, just a blanket of mist rolling in off the lake, muffling everything. I parked the RV near the edge of the water, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth swirling around me. It was late afternoon and the sky was overcast, casting a muted gray over the landscape. I stood there, staring out at the lake, remembering all those summers when Will and I would fish from the shore, making up ghost stories about the lights we swore we saw over the water. "The lake's cursed," he'd whisper, his eyes wide, "and the lights, they're the souls of people who drowned here, warning us away." Night fell faster than I'd expected. I made myself a small fire and settled into a folding chair, staring out at the lake, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. Just when I thought I'd fall asleep right there, something caught my eye. A flickering light, barely visible through the mist, hovering over the lake. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I was seeing things. But then it pulsed again, brighter, like a candle flickering to life in the middle of nowhere. I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness, watching as more lights appeared, floating just above the water's surface. They moved in slow, drifting patterns, as if they were dancing. For a moment, I felt a strange pull, like the lights were calling me, inviting me closer. But I shook it off, telling myself they were reflections, some kind of natural phenomenon. Maybe lights from boats, or even a couple of other campers who'd settled across the lake without me realizing it. But as I watched, I felt a chill run through me. There were no boats. There were no other campers. It was just me out here. The lights danced on, flickering in strange, unsteady patterns, and as I watched, I felt a prickling at the back of my neck. It was almost like they were watching me back. I don't know when I started hearing the voice. I must have been half asleep, lulled by the fire, the night settling heavy around me. But suddenly, there it was, faint and far off, drifting across the lake. "Ben?" I jolted awake, blinking into the dark, my heart hammering. It was probably just the wind, I told myself, the sound echoing weirdly across the water. But then I heard it again. "Ben?" It was barely more than a whisper, so soft I thought I was imagining it. But it sounded like Will. That was the strangest part. Like he was standing right there on the other side of the lake, calling me, just like when we were kids. I stood up, peering into the darkness, the fog swirling thick over the lake. The lights flickered again, closer this time, and I could almost make out a shape between them, a shadow in the mist. But when I blinked, it was gone. "You're losing it, Ben," I muttered, shaking my head. "Grief does weird things to people," I reminded myself. "Makes them see things, hear things, especially in a place that holds so many memories." But the voice, soft and persistent, kept drifting across the water. "Ben." The next morning, I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just a trick of my mind. But as I walked down to the lake's edge, something caught my eye. A small, rusted fishing lure lying in the sand. It was the same kind Will used to use. I recognized the faded blue and silver paint, the way it was chipped just at the tip. It looked just like the one he'd carried around every summer, insisting it was his lucky lure. I picked it up, running my fingers over the rusty metal, feeling a wave of nostalgia and sorrow wash over me. How had it gotten here? The lure should have been lost decades ago. I felt a pang of something sharp and uneasy. I glanced back at the lake, but it was still and empty, the fog thin and drifting. I pocketed the lure, trying not to think too much about it. That night, the lights came back, brighter this time. They moved closer to shore, flickering like they were trying to get my attention. I found myself drawn to them, stepping closer to the water, my heart racing. And then I saw him. Will was standing at the edge of the lake, his face shadowed but unmistakable, staring at me from across the water. My breath caught in my throat as I stared back, every logical thought slipping from my mind. It was him. Same height, same build, even that old flannel jacket he used to wear everywhere. "Will?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, just lifted his hand, beckoning me, his face calm, almost peaceful. I felt a strange pull, an urge to follow him, to walk into the water and join him, but something held me back. Some small voice of reason reminding me that this couldn't be real. I blinked, and when I looked again, he was gone. The next day, I found an old journal tucked under a rock by the shore. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but I could make out enough to understand. The entries were written by someone who had camped here years ago, describing the lights on the lake, the voices calling out to him. One line stood out, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The lights want you in the water. Don't follow them." I felt a shiver run through me, my mind racing with questions. Could someone else have experienced the same thing I was seeing now? The lights, the voices, even the figure of a loved one calling to them? That night, I was more determined than ever to resist whatever was out there. But the lake had other plans. As darkness fell, the lights appeared again, dancing closer, almost within reach. I stood at the edge of the lake, staring into the mist, clutching the fishing lure in my pocket like a talisman. And then I heard it, clearer than ever. "Ben, come here." It was Will's voice, soft and familiar, calling me like he'd done 1,000 times before. My mind screamed that it was impossible, that it couldn't be him, but my heart wanted to believe. I took a step forward, the water lapping at my shoes. I could see his figure again, just out of reach, his face calm, a faint smile on his lips. He looked at peace, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, like I could finally let go, finally find closure. I took another step, my feet sinking into the sand, the water cold against my skin. "Join me," he whispered, his voice carrying over the lake, the lights flickering like stars. "It's okay, Ben." I took a deep breath, feeling myself slipping under the lake's spell, ready to follow him. But then a memory came rushing back. A final conversation we'd had years ago, where Will had told me, Don't hold on to me, Ben. Just live your life." The words jolted me back to reality. I stopped, staring at the water, feeling the coldness seep into my bones. I looked up, and the figure of Will was gone, replaced by a cluster of lights hovering just above the lake, drifting back into the mist. I took a step back, heart pounding, breaking free from the lake's pull. In the early dawn light, I packed up the RV, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me. As I prepared to leave, I glanced back at the lake one last time. The fog was lifting, and I thought I saw a faint figure at the water's edge, watching me. It lifted a hand in a silent farewell, and for a brief moment, I felt a strange peace wash over me. I drove away, leaving Deadwater Point behind, the weight of my grief lifting, if only slightly. I didn't have all the answers, and maybe I never would. But somehow I felt that I'd finally said goodbye. Months later, on quiet nights, I still dream of the lake, the lights flickering over the water and the echo of my brother's voice. Whether it's a memory or something more, I don't know. But I do know that Deadwater Point will always hold a piece of me, just as it holds a piece of him. And maybe, in some strange way, that's exactly how it's meant to be. I'd driven to Lake of the Woods with one goal in mind: silence. After a grueling few months, I needed to escape. Teaching teenagers drained me, and the recent breakup had left me raw and restless. I thought some time alone in the wild would help me reset, give me the peace I'd been craving. The lake was beautiful, remote, everything I'd imagined. The water was still, perfectly mirroring the trees and sky above, and there was something otherworldly about it, a purity I'd never felt before. I parked the RV by the shore, taking in the silence. I'd heard stories of strange sightings out here. Locals talked about a mirror man who could be seen in reflections, a sort of double that emerged if you looked at yourself too long. People said he'd take your place if you weren't careful, trapping you in his world while he lived in yours. I'd laughed it off, amused by the idea of campfire ghost stories around such a peaceful lake. Just as the sun began to set, I found a large stone near the shoreline with words carved faintly into it. "Do not look too long into yourself." I smirked, brushing it off as a joke, maybe a prank left by someone who'd stayed here before. I'd come for rest, after all, not superstitions. That first evening, I sat by the shore, casting a line into the water. I hadn't gone fishing in years, but I'd wanted to do something that required patience, something to help me unwind. The sun was sinking below the trees, casting a golden glow over the lake, which was still calm, almost too calm. I stared at my reflection, a sharp silhouette against the shimmering light. It was just my own face, my own body, and yet something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it. The eyes, maybe? They looked darker, sharper somehow, like they were watching me with an intensity I didn't feel. Then, just as I was about to look away, I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible smile. I jerked back, my heart racing. I hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't even felt the urge to smile, and yet my reflection had grinned back at me. I blinked and stared down again, but now everything was normal. Just me staring back. It was probably a trick of the light, a distortion in the water. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the discomfort, and gathered my things. I couldn't quite shake the feeling of that smile, though. It followed me back to the RV, lingering in my mind as I locked the door and settled in for the night. I slept fitfully, tossing and turning as fragments of dreams tugged at my mind. I'd be back at the lake, staring at myself, but my reflection was always wrong. The face would shift, the eyes narrowing with a predatory glint, that strange, unsettling smile spreading across its lips. Sometime in the dead of night, a noise jolted me awake. It was soft, almost like footsteps moving around the RV. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. The footsteps circled the RV, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside the door. I held my breath, frozen in place. Then a whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. "Adam." I went cold. It was my own voice, low, distorted, but unmistakably mine, calling out from just beyond the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, a primal instinct urging me to check. But something deep inside told me not to open it. My breath caught as the footsteps started again, slow, purposeful, fading into the distance until there was only silence. I sat in the dark for hours, too shaken to sleep, until the first light of dawn crept through the window. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, or maybe a trick of my overactive imagination. I needed to get out, to clear my head. Grabbing my camera, I headed down to the shore where the lake was calm and still, reflecting the sky in perfect clarity. As I lifted the camera to capture the scene, I noticed something strange. In the water, my reflection looked wrong. It was subtle at first, just a slight lag in its movements, like it was mimicking me a beat too late. When I waved, it hesitated before mirroring me. I turned my head, and it followed a second behind. I felt a creeping sense of dread, but I forced myself to keep looking, my heart racing as I tried to understand what was happening. Then, just as I was about to pull back, the reflection smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a chill through my body. "Stop it," I whispered, my voice shaky, but the reflection only grinned wider, the eyes narrowing, darkening, as if savoring my fear. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and the reflection returned to normal, staring back at me blankly. The warning carved into the stone by the shore echoed in my mind. Do not look too long into yourself. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself that I was just tired, maybe a little on edge, but the image of that twisted smile lingered, gnawing at my thoughts. I avoided looking into the lake after that, afraid of what I might see. That night, I sat in the RV, the wind rattling the windows, filling the silence with a faint, unsettling hum. I tried to focus on reading, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced at my reflection in the window, I felt as though it was waiting, watching, somehow aware. Just as I was starting to drift off, a sharp knock at the RV door jolted me awake. The knocking was soft at first, then grew louder, more insistent. My heart raced as I sat up, staring at the door. Then, from the other side, I heard my own voice, low and calm. "Adam, come out." The voice was soothing, coaxing, like I was talking to myself. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the bed as the voice continued. "Come out, Adam. I want to show you something." The urge to open the door was overpowering, like an invisible hand pulling me forward. I stood, hand shaking as I reached for the handle, but at the last second, I stopped myself, snapping out of the trance. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice trembling. The knocking stopped and silence filled the RV once more. I stayed up the rest of the night, watching the door, waiting, but the voice didn't come back. When morning finally broke, I felt a wave of relief, grateful that the night was over. I couldn't stand to stay another night. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my things, throwing everything into the RV as quickly as possible. I didn't even want to look at the lake as I left, but as I climbed into the driver's seat, a strange impulse pulled at me. I glanced in the side mirror, and there, standing at the shore, was my reflection. It was watching me, its face twisted in that same chilling smile, eyes gleaming with something dark, something knowing. I turned away, refusing to look back as I started the RV and sped down the dirt road, my heart racing as I left Lake of the Woods behind. Back home, I tried to convince myself it was over. I threw myself into work, keeping busy, but that feeling of being watched never fully left. I found myself avoiding mirrors, afraid of catching a glimpse of that twisted smile, that shadowy version of myself. Every reflective surface felt like a trap, a window into something I didn't want to see. And then, one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. At first, it was just my reflection, blank, ordinary. But then, slowly, the lips curled into that same haunting grin, the eyes darkening, gleaming with malice. I stumbled back, heart pounding as my reflection moved, raising its hand in a slow, mocking wave, even though I was perfectly still. "Adam?" it whispered, my own voice dripping with something dark, something hungry. "I'm still here." I turned away, refusing to look, my heart racing as I backed out of the bathroom. But I knew, even without looking, that the reflection was watching, waiting, and that I would never truly be free of it. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the voice, soft and coaxing, calling from the other side of the mirror, "Adam, let me in." When I pulled up to the edge of Red Canyon, I could feel the anticipation buzzing in my veins. I'd been searching for these petroglyphs for months, following every lead and rumor, studying maps and listening to locals' half-whispered stories. This remote area of Canyonlands National Park was home to some of the most mysterious carvings known to archaeologists, and they weren't on any official map. No one believed I'd actually find them. Maybe they were right. But I wasn't about to give up. This trip, I was certain, would change everything. I parked my RV at a secluded spot hidden by a cluster of boulders. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the red sandstone cliffs, and a soft wind whistled through the canyon, carrying with it a faint, earthy scent. I stepped outside, took a deep breath, and set off, ready to lose myself in the silence and majesty of the canyons. As I hiked deeper into Red Canyon, the silence felt almost sacred. Towering rock walls surrounded me, creating a narrow, winding path that felt more like a corridor than a trail. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching over the dry ground and the occasional call of a distant bird. Every so often, I'd stop, look around, and feel the weight of the place pressing down on me, as if the rocks themselves were watching, waiting. The petroglyphs had to be somewhere near. That evening, as I returned to my RV, a park ranger appeared seemingly out of nowhere. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and the sight of him caught me off guard. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat. "Not many folks come this deep into the canyon." I nodded, my pulse still racing. "I'm, here to photograph some petroglyphs. They're supposed to be around here, right?" The ranger's face tightened. "If you're talking about the ancient petroglyphs, some of those areas are protected. Sacred land." The locals say they're guarded by something or someone." He paused, his gaze sharp. "They call him the Watcher." I almost laughed, but caught myself. The ranger's face was serious, his eyes shadowed beneath his hat. "The Watcher?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "A spirit of the canyon. The legend goes that he protects those sacred places. He doesn't like trespassers, especially the ones who don't show respect." "Sounds like just a story," I replied, trying to sound confident, though I could feel a faint unease prickling at the back of my mind. The ranger didn't smile. "Maybe, but folks who go looking for him tend not to come back the same." He tipped his hat again. "Stay safe out here." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, his footsteps muffled by the sand. I shook off his words, telling myself it was just folklore, meant to keep people like me out of hidden places. But that night, as I lay in bed, I kept thinking about the Watcher, the ancient spirit supposedly guarding these cliffs, his wide, unblinking eyes carved into the stone. The next day, I woke with renewed determination. I set off early, the morning sun casting a warm glow over the canyon walls. After a few hours of hiking, I stumbled upon a narrow crevice in the rock, almost invisible from the main trail. Something in me sparked, and I squeezed through, heart racing. On the other side was a hidden alcove, and along its walls were the petroglyphs. They were like nothing I'd ever seen. The carvings depicted tall, slender figures with elongated arms and hollow eyes, staring outward. They stood in rows, each figure identical, as if they were an army of watchers guarding something unseen. One figure was larger than the rest, towering over the others, its eyes wide and hollow, its gaze almost sentient. I snapped photo after photo, documenting every inch, every line. As I worked, a strange sensation crept over me, a prickling, like I was being watched. I turned, half expecting to see the ranger, but I was alone. The silence around me felt deeper, thicker, as if the canyon itself had drawn a breath and was holding it, waiting. I forced myself to keep photographing, but my hands were trembling, and my heart pounded with a strange, unshakable fear. That night, back at the RV, the air felt heavier, more oppressive. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with images of the petroglyphs, those hollow eyes boring into me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside the RV, soft and measured, like someone pacing. I sat up, my heart pounding, and peeked through the window. There, standing just beyond the campfire's glow, was a figure. A tall, slender man, dressed in dark clothing. I couldn't see his face, but he was watching me, his head tilted slightly to the side, like he was studying me. Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back into the darkness, his footsteps silent. I sat there, breathless, staring into the empty night, the words of the ranger echoing in my mind. The Watcher. The next morning, I found footprints around my RV, leading from the canyon and stopping just outside my door. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the figure I'd seen was probably another hiker or even an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the Watcher was real, that he was out there watching me. Driven by a strange compulsion, I returned to the petroglyphs. As I examined them again, I noticed something unsettling. The eyes of the largest figure seemed more intense, more alive, as if they were following me. I could have sworn the carvings had changed slightly, that the figures were looking at me with a strange, silent judgment. Then I noticed a small inscription beneath the largest figure. It was faint, nearly worn away by time, but I could make out a few words. "Do not disturb the watcher, or you will never leave." A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. This was what I had come here for: documentation, discovery, proof that I could find something important. Ignoring the warning, I continued photographing, determined to capture every detail. But as the day wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, and a sense of dread settled over me. As the sun began to set, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps echoing through the canyon, steady and unhurried. I turned, scanning the rocks, and saw him, the same figure standing on a ledge above me, his eyes wide and unblinking, watching my every move. I backed away, my heart pounding, stumbling over rocks and loose gravel. No matter how far I walked, he was always there, following, his eyes never leaving me. By the time I made it back to the RV, I was shaking, drenched in sweat. I jumped into the driver's seat, desperate to leave. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but it was no use. The sun had fully set, and the canyon was cloaked in darkness. The silence was absolute, oppressive, and I felt the weight of the watcher's gaze pressing down on me. I sat there, my heart racing, listening to the silence. Then, from the radio, a faint static crackled to life. Through the static, I heard a whisper, low and haunting, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The voice grew louder, filling the RV, the words twisting and echoing until they sounded like my own name. I turned off the radio, my hands shaking, but the whispering continued, filling the RV, seeping into my mind until I felt like I was suffocating. And then I saw him, standing just outside the RV, his eyes glowing in the darkness, wide and hollow. The Watcher. I scrambled out of the RV, stumbling into the darkness, and ran back to the petroglyphs. My only thought was that I needed to make amends, to do something, anything, to stop him from following me. I reached the wall, gasping for breath, and placed my camera and a small offering of food and water in front of the petroglyphs, hoping it would be enough. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I didn't mean to disturb you. Please, let me go." The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there he was, standing just a few feet away, his eyes locked onto mine. His gaze was unyielding, filled with a knowledge and power that went beyond anything human. For a moment, he simply watched me, and I felt the weight of his judgment. Then, slowly, he tilted his head, as though considering my offering. The seconds stretched into eternity, and just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, he began to fade, dissolving into the mist like smoke. I stood there, breathless, the silence pressing down on me. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the presence was gone. The next morning, I found my RV still and silent, as though nothing had happened. The engine started without a hitch, and I drove away, the canyons receding into the distance behind me. As I left, I realized I'd left my camera and the petroglyph photographs behind, but I felt no urge to go back for them. Some things I knew were best left alone. And as I drove away, I could still feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting, a silent reminder that the canyon and the Watcher were not meant to be disturbed. When I first saw the Olympic National Forest spread out before me, I thought I'd found the perfect place to forget. The towering pines, shrouded in mist, stretched on for miles, thick and dense enough to shut out the world. I'd come here to escape, to lose myself in the silence and maybe find some kind of peace. But as I stood there, staring into the mist-laden woods, I felt a strange unease, a sense that the forest was watching me, waiting. I brushed off the feeling. I was here to clear my mind, not dwell on the past. So I set up my RV in a secluded spot by a narrow trail, hidden beneath the thick canopy. As night fell, the quiet grew heavier, settling around me like a shroud. I sat outside, staring into the trees, listening to the sound of the wind rustling through the branches. Then I heard it. Footsteps, faint and slow, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, straining to listen. The steps grew louder, echoing through the trees. But just as I started to rise, they stopped. Silence settled over the forest once more, but the feeling of being watched lingered. My skin prickled, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I told myself it was nothing. An animal, maybe, or just the sounds of the forest. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the reach of the light. The next morning, I woke up to find footprints outside my RV. They were deep and heavy, leading from the woods to my RV door, and then stopping suddenly, as though whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. I stood there, staring at the tracks, my mind racing. There was no one around for miles, and no car but mine on the narrow dirt road that led here. Trying to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at my stomach, I decided to hike, hoping a long walk would clear my head. The forest was quiet, the thick mist clinging to the trees, muffling every sound. As I walked, I felt a strange pull, like something was guiding me deeper into the forest. About an hour in, I saw him. A figure standing in the fog up ahead, half hidden by the trees. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, his face obscured by shadow. For a moment, I thought he was another camper, someone who'd wandered too close to my campsite. But as I watched, he turned, slipping further into the mist without a word. "Hey," I called out, picking up my pace to catch up with him. But by the time I reached the spot where he'd been standing, he was gone, vanished into the trees. I stood there, my heart pounding, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow. I was imagining things, letting the isolation get to me. But as I walked back to my RV, I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing there, watching me. That night, the fog grew thicker, wrapping around my RV like a blanket. I sat inside, trying to read, but every sound made me jump. The silence was too heavy, too complete. And then, just as I was about to go to bed, I saw it. A piece of paper stuck to my windshield, fluttering in the faint breeze. I opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air, and pulled the paper from the glass. Scrawled in black ink, in large, jagged letters, were the words, "You can't run forever." My stomach twisted, my mind racing. Who could have left this here? Was it the man I'd seen in the forest? But why? And how did he know? I crumpled the note in my hand, throwing it to the ground. It didn't mean anything, I told myself, just some sick prank, a coincidence. But as I climbed back into the RV, I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping over me. The sense that someone knew me, knew what I was running from. As the night wore on, I heard whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from outside. I lay there, listening, my heart pounding, as the voices grew louder, more insistent. I thought I heard my name, whispered on the wind, and then closer. Ethan! I bolted upright, my breath catching. I peered through the window, my eyes scanning the darkness, and there, standing at the edge of my campsite, was the figure. The same man I'd seen in the forest. He was watching me, his face hidden in shadow. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't respond. He stood there, silent, unmoving, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then, as I blinked, he slipped back into the mist, disappearing once more. The next day, I hiked further, hoping to find some trace of the man, some clue as to who he was and what he wanted. As I walked, I noticed small objects scattered along the trail, things I hadn't seen before. A broken compass, just like the one Mike, my best friend, used to carry. A small, faded photograph of us as kids, tucked into the branches of a tree. My heart pounded, the memories flooding back. Mike, the car accident, the years I'd spent running from the guilt, convincing myself it wasn't my fault, that it had just been a terrible, unavoidable tragedy. But I knew the truth, even if I'd never admitted it to anyone else. I was the one driving that night. I was the one who'd lost control. The objects felt like accusations, scattered along the trail as a reminder of the past I'd tried so hard to forget. And as I picked up the photograph, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, my heart racing, and saw him, the stranger, standing a few feet away, his face still obscured, his eyes cold and unblinking. You're not real," I stammered, clutching the photograph. The stranger tilted his head, his gaze fixed on me, and then, in a voice that chilled me to the bone, he spoke. "Why did you leave me, Ethan?" The voice was Mike's, soft, accusing, the way I'd last heard it, echoing in the car that night. My blood ran cold, and I felt my hands start to shake. "You're not real," I repeated, my voice breaking. You're just a trick, a hallucination." The stranger took a step closer, his face still hidden in shadow. "You can't run from what you did, Ethan. You can't keep pretending it wasn't your fault." I backed away, my heart pounding, but every step I took, he matched, his presence growing stronger, more suffocating. "You left me," he whispered, his voice filling my mind. "You ran, and you never looked back. Do you think you can escape the truth?" I tried to respond, but my throat was tight, my mind racing. I turned and ran, stumbling through the forest, desperate to get away. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right behind me, his voice echoing in my mind. By the time I made it back to the RV, I was exhausted, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I slammed the door shut, locking it as though that could keep him out. I sank to the floor, clutching my head, trying to shut out his voice. But as night fell, the whispers returned, louder this time, filling the RV. I heard his footsteps outside, circling, growing closer, and then, finally, the door creaked open. I looked up, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his face half hidden in shadow, his eyes empty, hollow. "You can't hide forever, Ethan," he whispered, stepping closer. "You have to face what you did. You have to admit the truth." I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me, suffocating, crushing, and in that moment, I knew he was right. I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. The guilt, the pain, It had festered inside me for too long, growing stronger with every passing year. "I'm sorry," I choked, tears streaming down my face. I didn't want to." The stranger watched me, his expression softening as though he'd been waiting for this. And as I spoke, as I let the words pour out, he began to fade, dissolving into the mist. By the time I finished, he was gone, leaving only silence. The next morning, I woke to find the mist had lifted, the forest bathed in sunlight. The weight that had pressed down on me was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet peace. As I packed up to leave, I found one last message scratched into the dirt by the RV door. "Let it go." I stood there, staring at the words, feeling a sense of release wash over me. I'd come to the forest to escape, but instead, I'd found something far more valuable. A way to face the guilt I'd carried for so long. As I drove away, I took one last look at the trees, the fog beginning to gather again in the distance. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally move forward. I had read about Stone Creek Campground on a paranormal forum. The posts weren't like the usual urban legends. There were stories of strange sounds, missing campers, and some kind of creature that locals called the Hunger. The whole thing sounded ridiculous, the perfect material for my YouTube channel. I was in desperate need of a bump in views, and a haunted campground sounded like it could be just the thing to reignite my audience's interest. The place was remote, tucked away in the Ouachita Mountains, surrounded by thick forest and a dried-up lake. By the time I pulled the RV into what used to be the campground's main lot, the sun was starting to dip behind the hills. I shut off the engine and stepped outside, breathing in the dry, cool air. Stone Creek had been abandoned for years. Weeds grew through the cracks in the pavement, and what was left of the lake was nothing but a cracked, barren bed that looked like a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. Perfect, I thought, setting up my camera to get a shot of the place. My YouTube channel thrived on creepy, abandoned sites, but there was something about Stone Creek that even I couldn't shake off. It felt too empty. The silence pressed down like a weight. As I explored, I found a weathered sign by the edge of the lake. Faded red paint spelled out, "Beware the Hunger, do not stay after dark." I chuckled, recording a close-up for my intro. "Ooh, spooky," I said, rolling my eyes. "The Hunger, huh? Guess that's what happens when you leave your food out for raccoons." Laughing to myself, I walked around, kicking up dust as I documented the broken-down cabins and old fire pits. They looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. I found some torn shoes, a shredded backpack, and even a rusted tent pole. It was as if campers had just up and vanished. By dusk, I'd gathered plenty of footage and set up my main camera to catch any nighttime activity. In my mind, that just meant wildlife. Maybe some raccoons or coyotes if I was lucky. The whole idea of the Hunger was a nice touch for storytelling, but I didn't believe for a second that anything supernatural was lurking out here. I sat by the dried lake bed waiting for night to fall, my small campfire crackling beside me. Shadows stretched across the cracked earth, and the place grew even quieter if that was possible. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just silence. As the last of the sunlight faded, I began my recording. All right, guys, it's officially night here at Stone Creek. I've got cameras set up all around the lake bed, so if there's anything out here, we're going to catch it. I grinned at the camera, feeling the adrenaline kick in. Then I heard it. a low, grinding noise like rocks scraping together. I whipped around, my flashlight illuminating nothing but the cracked, barren ground. The sound stopped, and I held my breath, straining to listen. Just as I convinced myself it was a trick of my imagination, the grinding came again, louder this time and unmistakably close. "Guess we've got our first creepy sound of the night," I said to the camera, trying to keep my voice steady. Not that I believe in the hunger, but hey, anything for the views. But the sound didn't stop. It grew like rocks shifting against each other, circling the campsite. I switched on my handheld camera, swinging it toward the lake bed just in time to catch something on the edge of the flashlight's beam. Something large and dark moving slowly across the cracked earth. I held my breath, trying to make sense of it. It was just a glimpse, but the shape was huge, its surface rough and uneven, blending in with the shadows of the lake bed. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. My heart raced and I laughed nervously. "Probably just a rock slide, right?" I muttered, trying to convince myself. But rocks don't move like that, I thought, an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. I spent the next few hours pacing around the RV, checking my footage, trying to spot any sign of whatever I'd just seen. But every time I reviewed the footage, I noticed something strange. The audio had picked up a low, rumbling growl, like the sound of something massive shifting. But whenever I tried to listen to it again, the sound was gone, replaced by nothing but faint static. Then I saw it again, just past the edge of my campsite, right where the lake bed met the trees. Something moved, its form blending into the shadows, almost as if it were a part of the rocks themselves. Its eyes glinted in the dark, faint and cold, like distant stars. I swallowed, grabbing my flashlight. "Who's there?" I called, though my voice shook. Silence. The figure was gone again. I backed away, a chill crawling up my spine. I'd planned on staying the night, but something about this place felt wrong. I decided I'd pack up first thing in the morning. Around midnight, I wandered away from the RV, heading toward an old ranger station I'd spotted earlier. I figured it might hold some interesting stuff for the video. Old records, maps, anything spooky to add to the story. Inside, the place was crumbling, the walls streaked with mold and decay. Dust hung heavy in the air as I picked through old papers on the floor. One of them was a faded report, handwritten by a ranger decades ago. I read the lines under my flashlight, my pulse quickening with every word. Campers reported strange sightings near the lake bed, a creature with a stone-like exterior. It moves with the shadows, always hungry. They call it the hunger. The report ended abruptly, the last line scratched out violently, as if the writer hadn't had time to finish. I shone my light on the wall and noticed deep claw marks gouged into the wood, as though something had scraped at the wall in a fit of rage. My mouth went dry, and I backed away, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I returned to the RV, deciding then and there that I'd had enough of Stone Creek. I'd come for a ghost story, but this was something else, something alive. I climbed into the RV, grabbing my keys and jamming them into the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then died. I tried again. Nothing. My stomach twisted as I realized I was stuck here, alone, with whatever was lurking outside. I sat in the driver's seat, breathing heavily, when I heard it. The low, grinding sound again, closer this time, circling the RV like a predator. My flashlight flickered as I turned it toward the window. I caught a glimpse of something massive, hunched just outside, its rough, stone-like skin catching the faint light. Its face was featureless, but I could feel it staring, feel the weight of its gaze. Then it moved. I scrambled to the back of the RV, heart pounding as the grinding sound followed, scraping along the side of the vehicle. I grabbed my camera, pointing it toward the noise, hoping that if I recorded it, maybe someone would know what happened here, even if I didn't make it out. "This is Mikey," I whispered into the lens, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. "I don't know what's out there, but if you're watching this, don't come here. Just stay away." The RV rattled as something heavy slammed into the side, and I bit back a scream. I could see it now, a massive, shifting figure in the shadows, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of something ancient and unstoppable. The creature, the hunger, had a shape that was almost human but twisted, with limbs that shifted like rock and a face that was more shadow than anything else. Its eyes gleamed faintly, cold and empty, fixed on me with an intent that was both intelligent and horrifyingly primal. It needed to feed. In one last, desperate move, I flung the door open and bolted toward the ranger station, hoping the building would offer some kind of shelter. The ground seemed to shift beneath me, stones sliding under my feet as if they were alive, guiding me back toward the lake bed. I stumbled into the station, slamming the door shut and pushing a cabinet in front of it. The grinding sound grew louder, echoing through the walls. I could feel the creature's presence pressing down on me, filling the small space with a suffocating weight. With shaken hands, I set up the camera, pointing it at the door. I sat in front of it, staring into the lens, my voice barely a whisper. "This is Mikey Fields, and if anyone finds this, I'm sorry. I don't think I'm getting out of here. I don't know what it wants, but it's hungry. Don't come here. Just don't." The door creaked, and I turned to see the outline of the creature in the doorway, a mass of stone and shadow, filling the room with a darkness deeper than night. And then there was nothing but the grinding of stone and the cold, relentless hunger. The screen cut to black. The drive out to Red Valley was as lonely as I'd hoped. A few hours on empty highways, followed by miles of rugged desert road winding into the canyons near Sedona. Red cliffs towered around me, their surfaces painted with streaks of ochre and iron, casting long shadows as the sun dipped lower. This place was exactly what I needed: isolated, beautiful, and completely detached from my old life as a park ranger. I left my job months ago. I told people I needed a break from the forest, but the truth was, I hadn't been the same since the incident. I still woke up every night, hearing the crackling of leaves and branches, still replayed those final shouts that echoed in the forest, still felt the guilt that clung to me like a second skin. Red Valley was supposed to be my reset button, a place to find peace, silence, and maybe a bit of redemption. I parked the RV near the old trailhead, the only signs of human presence being the faded wooden marker and an old information board with nothing left but chipped paint and rusted bolts. I stepped out, feeling the desert heat on my skin, the silence stretching out in all directions. There wasn't even a breeze, just a thick, heavy quiet. Inside, I checked my watch. 5:12 p.m. I had a couple of hours of daylight left to explore before setting up camp. I grabbed my notebook and started a quick trek down the trail, looking for a spot with a view of the canyon. The desert was alive with colors, shadows stretching as the sun lowered, but something about it felt wrong. Time didn't feel right here. It felt sticky, slipping past too fast. I made it back to the RV just as the last slivers of sunlight disappeared behind the cliffs. Checking my watch, I frowned. 9:47 p.m. That couldn't be right. I'd only been out there an hour or two at most. My phone said the same thing. I chalked it up to a tech glitch and set up a small fire outside. The silence was thick as I sat there alone, watching the flames dance. And then I heard it, a faint voice echoing through the valley, a familiar voice. I turned, straining to listen, but the wind was the only sound. "It's nothing," I muttered, brushing it off as nerves. But I knew better. I'd been out here long enough to know when the land was trying to tell me something. I slept poorly that night, tossing and turning, and woke to a sunrise that felt too bright, too harsh. I groggily made my coffee, trying to shake off the unsettling dreams I couldn't quite remember. After a quick breakfast, I set out again, determined to explore the valley. My notebook was on the table where I'd left it, open to the same blank page I'd been meaning to fill. I tucked it into my pack and headed toward the trail. The desert seemed unchanged from the day before, yet I couldn't shake the sense that I was repeating myself, like I'd walked this exact route before. It was impossible, of course. I hadn't gone past the first mile marker yesterday. But then I saw them, footprints in the sand, my size, my tread pattern, and leading in the direction I was going. I froze, my mind racing. I hadn't gone this far yesterday, and there hadn't been anyone else here. I looked behind me, as if expecting to see someone following. Only silence. Shaking my head, I continued, hoping to shrug off the feeling, but it kept creeping back, that sense of being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But when I reached the canyon overlook and saw the faint outline of an old fire ring, a ring I hadn't seen before, with charred logs scattered around, I felt my stomach twist. There were footprints around it too, the same as mine. I didn't remember making this fire. I didn't remember being here at all. Back at the RV, I pored over my notes, the same ones I'd been jotting down since I arrived. The entries looked different, slightly off, like someone else had tried to copy my handwriting. My notes about the canyon's colors, the wildlife, the way the shadows moved, it all felt familiar, yet strangely distant, like something I'd written in a dream. Outside, the sky had darkened too quickly, faster than it should have. I checked my watch. 8:03 p.m. It had been 3:20 when I'd checked it last. I stood in the open doorway of the RV, staring out into the twilight. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice swallowed up by the canyon. Silence. But then, just as I started to step back inside, I heard a response. "Danny?" It was a whisper, soft and familiar, carried on the wind. It was my own voice calling to me from somewhere deep in the valley. I stumbled back, closing the door quickly. My heartbeat thundered in my chest as I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, things only got worse. I stepped outside to find my chair and water bottle exactly where I'd left them yesterday. Or at least, I thought I had. But they were off, turned at angles like someone had been sitting there. My footprints were everywhere, circling the RV, overlapping in a chaotic pattern that didn't make sense. As I walked down the trail, the same voices echoed through the canyon. snippets of conversations I'd had with friends, family, old colleagues, but they sounded distorted, faded, like memories decaying over time. I kept walking, hoping I'd find some explanation, but everything I saw only made it worse. I found more footprints, mine, leading deeper into the canyon, and more of those old fire rings. They were everywhere, as if I'd been here dozens, maybe hundreds of times. Then I saw it. Myself. Standing on the far side of the canyon, a figure stood in the same hiking clothes I wore, head tilted, watching me. He looked just like me. Same beard, same scar on his left cheek, same hiking boots. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, watching. I moved forward, and he mirrored me exactly, step for step, a perfect echo. I took a shaky breath, feeling my grip on reality slipping. "Who? What are you?" I whispered. The figure's mouth moved, forming the same words. I turned and ran, feeling the weight of the figure's gaze on my back. When I finally made it back to the RV, I slammed the door, locking it behind me, as if that would do any good. Outside, the wind had picked up, whispering my name over and over, "Danny, Danny," in a tone that was both mocking and desperate. Desperation clawed at me. I had to get out of here, had to break free from whatever loop had taken hold of me. I grabbed my keys, started the RV, and tried to drive out. But every turn I took led me back to the same place, the same stretch of canyon, over and over. Time lost all meaning as I circled endlessly, the sky darkening and lightening in ways that made no sense. It was then I realized what I had to do. I reached for the only thing that had meant something to me, my old ranger badge, a token of a life I'd lost. The badge was tarnished, worn from years of use, but it represented everything I'd left behind, the memories and the guilt I'd carried with me. I took the badge and flung it into the canyon, screaming as I let it go. It disappeared over the edge, swallowed by the shadows below. For a moment, the wind died. The valley went silent, still. And then, slowly, a path opened up before me, the rocks shifting to reveal a narrow trail leading out of Red Valley. I didn't hesitate. I climbed into the RV and drove, following the path as it twisted and turned, finally leading me toward the open road. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I made it out of Red Valley just as dawn broke, the sun casting a warm light over the desert. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of me was still back there, in that twisted canyon. Later, as I reviewed the footage from my trip, I noticed something odd. In the background of every recording, there was a shadow, a figure standing in the distance, watching. And in the final frame, just before I'd thrown my badge away, I saw him again, a version of me, standing alone in Red Valley repeating the same endless loop. The realization hit me like a punch. A part of me was still there, trapped, left behind in the canyon's echo. And maybe, just maybe, I'd never truly escaped. It felt like a lifetime since I'd been to Hollow Point, but here I was, pulling up the RV on the same patch of forest where Sarah and I used to camp. Everything looked the same, untouched by time. The dense pine trees, the thick moss carpeting the ground, and, just beyond, the lake, still as glass under the fading daylight. Hollow Point had always felt like a world apart, a place where reality bent, where everything felt softer, quieter. I'd hoped that returning here would bring me some kind of peace. But so far, all I've felt was a hollow ache. I set up camp slowly, deliberately, unpacking her telescope last. It felt strange to even touch it after all this time. Sarah had loved stargazing, loved to lie beside me in the dark and marvel at the sky, as if the stars themselves were whispering secrets just for her. Tonight, the stars were already shining as the last streaks of sunlight faded. Casting a deep indigo over the lake, I set up the telescope by the shore, focusing it on a cluster of stars Sarah had loved, feeling the weight of her absence pressing down on me like a stone. After a while, I leaned back, staring at the darkening water. And that's when I saw them. The lights. At first, they were faint, like fireflies hovering just above the lake's surface. But they grew brighter, taking on shades of green, blue, and violet, shifting and swirling in patterns I'd never seen before. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and I couldn't look away. I grabbed my camera and started filming, whispering to myself, "Well, Sarah, looks like you'd have loved this one. Look at those lights." But even as I spoke, I felt something odd. The lights seemed alive. They moved with a purpose, drifting closer to the shore as if beckoning me to follow. A shiver ran through me, but I dismissed it as just nerves. I'd read about local legends calling them the wandering lights. People said they'd lure you into the forest, into places you couldn't return from. But I didn't believe that nonsense. These were probably just a rare phenomenon, like some strange atmospheric reflection, I told myself, a trick of nature. Still, as the lights continued to pulse and sway, something about them felt familiar, almost comforting, as if Sarah were there, watching me. That night, I dreamed of her for the first time in months. We were here, by the lake, lying side by side on the ground, her hand warm in mine. She was looking up at the stars, smiling, her eyes filled with that wonder that always made her seem like she was part of some other world. I could almost hear her voice, soft and close, whispering, "Graham, follow the lights." When I woke up, the lake was calm and the lights were gone, but her words stayed with me. Follow the lights. I spent the day walking the trails around the lake, feeling that strange pull gnawing at me, drawing me back to the shore as the sun began to sink behind the trees. And as night fell, the lights returned, drifting just beyond the lake's edge, their colors sharper, brighter, like tiny stars swirling just out of reach. The next night, they returned, this time even closer, and the night after that, they seemed to dance in patterns that felt oddly personal, like a message I couldn't quite understand. It was crazy, but part of me began to wonder if the lights were a sign, if somehow Sarah was watching me through them, reaching out across the divide. And with each night, that feeling grew stronger, a certainty that if I just followed them, I might see her again. On the fourth night, the lights appeared brighter than ever, a breathtaking, shimmering display that made my heart ache with longing. They hovered right at the edge of the water, so close I felt like I could reach out and touch them. "Sarah?" I whispered into the stillness, my voice trembling. The lights shifted, and for a moment, I swore I heard her voice in the wind, soft and familiar, calling my name. The lights drifted deeper into the forest, pulsing like a heartbeat, their colors vivid and alive. Without thinking, I took a step forward, then another, feeling that magnetic pull, that desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she was out there, waiting for me. I followed them along the shoreline, the forest growing denser, the trail winding deeper into shadows. The lights bobbed and twisted, weaving between trees, drawing me farther into the darkness, always just out of reach. I don't know how long I walked, but time seemed to blur, my focus entirely on the lights. The forest felt different now, heavier, as if it were pressing in on me. The trees cast long, twisted shadows that seemed to shift as I moved, their branches reaching down like arms. But I kept walking, the lights my only guide, until finally I reached a cliff overlooking the lake. The lights hovered just beyond the edge, flickering softly, almost invitingly. And there on the wind, I heard her voice again. "Graham, I'm here." I felt my breath catch, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. I stepped closer to the edge, peering down into the dark water far below, and the lights pulsed, brightening with each step, urging me forward. "Graham?" It was Sarah's voice, clear and close, whispering just behind me. But as I turned, I realized something was wrong. The voice, it didn't sound quite right. It was hollow, flat, lacking the warmth I remembered. And as I looked at the lights, I noticed that their movement had changed. They weren't just drifting, they were watching. A chill ran down my spine. I took a step back, and the lights pulsed faster, flickering in sharp, unnatural colors as if they were angry, demanding. The forest was silent, the air thick with tension, and I felt the cold realization settle in. Whatever was out here, it wasn't Sarah. I backed away from the edge, feeling a sudden panic clawing at me, but the lights drifted closer, filling my vision, their glow blinding and overwhelming. The air grew colder, the forest pressing in like a living thing, and I felt an almost unbearable urge to step forward, to surrender to the lights, to follow them into the dark. "No," I whispered, clenching my fists, fighting the pull with every ounce of strength I had. "Sarah's gone. She wouldn't want this." The lights pulsed violently, their colors shifting, twisting, filling my mind with images. Memories of Sarah, our last moments together, the overwhelming emptiness I'd felt since she'd left. They were trying to pull me in, to drown me in my own grief. I forced myself to look away, to break the trance. I turned, running through the dark forest, feeling the lights behind me, bright and furious. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the trees seeming to close in, branches clawing at my arms, my legs, trying to hold me back. The lights chased me, flickering in the corners of my vision, filling the air with that hollow, echoing voice, distorted now, mocking. "Graham, Graham." But I didn't look back. I kept running, refusing to listen, refusing to believe, until I finally broke through the tree line and saw my RV glinting in the moonlight by the shore. I stumbled inside, locking the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Outside, the lights hovered by the edge of the forest, pulsing angrily, their colors flashing like a warning. I watched them from the window, heart pounding, knowing that I'd come far too close to losing myself. As dawn broke, the lights faded, retreating back into the shadows, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. I left Hollow Point that morning, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me. The forest was calm, innocent in the daylight, but I knew the truth now. The lights weren't a sign from Sarah. They were something else entirely, something ancient and hungry, preying on people like me, people weighed down by loss, by grief, by longing for things that couldn't be. As I drove away, I felt a strange, bittersweet relief. I hadn't found peace, not exactly, but I'd found something else. A choice, a chance to live, even if it meant carrying the grief with me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching one last glimpse of Hollow Point disappearing into the distance. And there, just for a moment, I saw them again. The lights, hovering in the shadows, waiting. But this time I kept driving, leaving them behind, and I knew I wouldn't be coming back.